The roots of the partisan war in Ukraine during the Second World War were embedded in the turbulent geopolitics of Eastern Europe between the two global conflicts. Ukraine, at the heart of the continent, had endured a series of power shifts, occupations, and internal uprisings that shaped both its population's resilience and the competing claims over its territory. By the late 1930s, the region was divided between the Soviet Union, Poland, Romania, and Czechoslovakia. Eastern Galicia and Volhynia were under Polish rule. Northern Bukovina belonged to Romania, while Transcarpathia was part of Czechoslovakia. The remainder, including central and eastern Ukraine, formed the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic within the USSR. The 1939 Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union redrew the borders once again. Following the German invasion of Poland on 1 September 1939 and the Soviet entry from the east on 17 September, the USSR annexed eastern Galicia and Volhynia. In June 1940, the Soviets further absorbed northern Bukovina and Bessarabia from Romania. These annexations brought millions of Ukrainians under Soviet control, many of whom had little time to adjust to the new regime before the German invasion began. Within these newly acquired Western territories, Soviet policies were quickly implemented: forced collectivization, suppression of nationalist movements, arrests, and deportations. Between 1939 and 1941, over 300,000 people were deported from Western Ukraine to Siberia and Central Asia, including members of the intelligentsia, clergy, and peasantry. Many nationalist organizations, such as the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, OUN, were forced underground or into exile. These experiences, combined with memories of the 1932–1933 Holodomor in the Soviet-held East, fueled deep resentment toward Soviet authority among parts of the population. At the same time, Ukrainian nationalist organizations intensified their preparations. The OUN split in 1940 into two factions: OUN-M, led by Andriy Melnik, and OUN-B, under Stepan Bandera. Both viewed the coming conflict as an opportunity to establish an independent Ukrainian state. They maintained clandestine networks throughout Western Ukraine and established military training for future paramilitary units. Intelligence gathering and logistical planning were underway even before the German invasion, with the hope of exploiting the collapse of Soviet rule. The German General Staff also viewed Ukraine as a strategic prize. As early as 1940, planning for Operation Barbarossa emphasized the importance of Ukrainian grain, coal, and industrial output for the German war economy. The region's cities, including Kiev, Kharkiv, Dnipro, and Odessa, were key military targets. Nazi ideology further influenced operational goals. Hitler and the Nazi leadership saw Ukraine as a future Lebensraum, or living space, to be colonized and exploited. As such, no consideration was given to Ukrainian national aspirations. The SD and Einsatzgruppen were assigned to neutralize political opponents, intelligentsia, and undesirable elements after occupation. As Operation Barbarossa commenced on 22 June 1941, the scale of the German-Soviet front stretching over 2,900 kilometers made control of local populations and infrastructure a significant challenge. The Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS expected minimal partisan activity, believing that many Ukrainians would welcome them as liberators. In the initial weeks of the invasion, some local populations did cooperate, hoping the Germans would support Ukrainian independence. This perception changed rapidly in the face of brutal occupation policies. On the Soviet side, Preparations for partisan warfare had begun in 1940. Soviet military doctrine anticipated that, in the event of invasion, occupied territories should become centers of irregular resistance. NKVD and Red Army units began recruiting and training potential partisan leaders, stockpiling weapons, and creating rudimentary supply caches. However, the rapid German advance and the collapse of Soviet control across Ukraine in the summer of 1941 disrupted many of these plans. In Kyiv alone, over 600,000 Red Army troops were encircled and captured in September 1941. As a result, Soviet partisan networks in Ukraine had to be rebuilt from near zero, often relying on remnants of military units, local Communist Party members, and civilians loyal to Moscow. Meanwhile, other resistance movements emerged with different goals. The Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA, which would later become a major force in western Ukraine, began to form in 1942 from OUNB militias. Unlike Soviet partisans, their primary aim was the creation of an independent Ukrainian state, free from both German and Soviet control. This ideological divergence led to tensions and open conflict between rival partisan groups. Thus, by the end of 1941, Ukraine had become a fragmented and volatile landscape of overlapping occupations, resistance movements, and competing political agendas. The civilian population subjected to deportations, forced labor, executions, and reprisals was often caught in the middle. Over the next several years, sabotage, assassinations, ambushes, and guerrilla campaigns would shape the face of warfare in Ukraine, driven by both Soviet and Ukrainian nationalist partisans. Each side would wage its struggle for survival and supremacy, operating under vastly different ideologies, but facing a common enemy in the German occupation forces. As both the German occupiers and the Soviet government began to adjust their strategies in response to growing resistance, the partisan war in Ukraine would evolve into one of the most brutal and complex aspects of the Eastern Front. The lines between combatants and civilians, resistance and repression, strategy and survival would blur in a conflict defined not only by military aims, but also by the politics of occupation, loyalty, and national identity. The German invasion of the Soviet Union on 22nd of June 1941 marked the beginning of a vast and destructive campaign across Ukrainian territory. Army Group South, under Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, led the advance through Ukraine, aiming to seize Kyiv and the industrial basin of the Donbass. Within weeks, German forces penetrated deep into Soviet lines, capturing Lviv on 30th of June and approaching Kyiv by late August. The scale and speed of the offensive left the Red Army disorganized, and many Soviet units disintegrated under the pressure. As the Wehrmacht advanced, it left behind a vast rear area vulnerable to irregular resistance. The initial Soviet response to the occupation was disjointed. While NKVD units had been instructed to form stay-behind groups, the rapid collapse of frontline defenses made it difficult to organize effective partisan units. Many Soviet officials and political officers were either captured or killed. In urban centers such as Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Poltava, resistance networks were quickly decimated by the Gestapo and SD. German security operations relied on local collaborators, including auxiliary police units, to root out suspected Soviet agents. Despite these setbacks, some isolated Soviet partisan units managed to survive the initial occupation phase. These included remnants of Red Army formations that had escaped encirclement, local Komsomol and Communist Party activists, and NKVD-trained saboteurs. In areas such as the forests of Chernihiv and Sumy, small bands of fighters began organizing acts of sabotage against German supply lines, railways, and communications infrastructure. These early groups operated with minimal coordination or central direction, often lacking arms, medicine, or secure communications. German occupation policy quickly alienated the civilian population. The Reichskommissariat Ukraine, established in September 1941 under Erich Koch, implemented a brutal regime of forced labor, food requisitions, and executions. Koch publicly declared that Ukrainians were to be treated as serfs for the German state. Reprisals against villages suspected of aiding partisans were common. In some regions, entire communities were burned and their inhabitants shot. Between 1941 and 1943, over 1.5 million people from Ukraine were deported for forced labor in Germany, and many never returned. These policies contributed to growing resentment and increased support for anti-German resistance. In western Ukraine, the situation was further complicated by the actions of the OUNB. In late June 1941, after the capture of Lviv, OUNB members declared the formation of a Ukrainian state in the name of Stepan Bandera. However, the Germans rejected the proclamation and arrested Bandera and his associates. OUN militias were subsequently forced to operate underground. Some units initially collaborated with German forces in anti-Soviet operations, while others began preparing for a future armed struggle against all occupying powers. By 1942, these militias began forming the basis of what would become the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA, a distinct nationalist force not aligned with the Soviets. During the first months of occupation, the scale of partisan activity remained limited. In 1941, only 26 active partisan detachments operated in Ukraine, totaling fewer than 2,000 fighters. However, these units laid the groundwork for broader resistance. Raids against German convoys, sabotage of railway junctions, and the killing of collaborators began to appear in German military reports. These early operations, although small in scale, signaled the beginning of a protracted and escalating campaign of irregular warfare. The German military command recognized the threat posed by partisans, but initially underestimated its scope. Anti-partisan operations were assigned to rear security divisions and SS police units, often supported by local auxiliaries. These forces used collective punishment, hostage executions, and scorched earth tactics to discourage resistance. However, such brutality often had the opposite effect, driving more civilians into the forests to join partisan ranks. Villagers who lost relatives or homes to German reprisals increasingly provided food, shelter, and information to the resistance. Meanwhile, Soviet authorities began efforts to re-establish central control over partisan activity. In November 1941, the central headquarters of the partisan movement was created in Moscow under the leadership of Panteleimon Ponomarenko. Its goal was to coordinate sabotage operations, intelligence collection, and political agitation in occupied territories. Radio communication with isolated detachments in Ukraine remained sporadic, but couriers and aircraft drops were gradually introduced. By early 1942, more than 100 partisan units had been formed in Ukraine, though their size and effectiveness varied greatly. The terrain of Ukraine played a significant role in shaping the partisan struggle. Dense forests in the north and west provided cover for guerrilla operations, while open steppes in the south limited opportunities for concealment. Winter conditions, beginning in November 1941, further complicated logistics for both sides. Soviet partisans often lacked warm clothing, ammunition, and food, and depended heavily on the local population for survival. German supply lines were similarly stretched, and the rear areas became increasingly difficult to secure. In addition to Soviet-aligned partisans, the region saw the emergence of other irregular forces with distinct agendas. Peasant self-defense units, deserters from various armies, and armed bands of differing political allegiance added to the complexity of the resistance landscape. Some groups focused on survival or local defense rather than sabotage, while others engaged in criminal activity under the guise of resistance. The blurred lines between partisan warfare and banditry posed challenges for German counterinsurgency efforts and complicated Soviet attempts to maintain ideological discipline. As 1942 progressed, the scale and coordination of partisan operations in Ukraine began to improve. The opening phase of the war had demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of irregular resistance. Though the German army had advanced rapidly across Ukrainian territory, it now faced an increasingly hostile and unpredictable environment in its rear areas. For the partisans, the struggle had only begun. With every act of repression and every execution, more individuals were drawn into the underground war, one not fought on front lines, but in forests, villages, and rail junctions, where survival itself became resistance. By the spring of 1942, both the Soviet leadership and the German occupiers began to reassess their strategies concerning the situation in occupied Ukraine. The rapid collapse of Soviet forces the previous year had left a void that was not only political and administrative, but also deeply strategic. As German forces pushed eastward toward Stalingrad and the Caucasus, securing their rear areas became increasingly vital. Simultaneously, Soviet command structures sought to transform the scattered, under-equipped partisan groups in Ukraine into a coordinated tool of warfare. The central headquarters of the partisan movement, established in Moscow in late 1941, was tasked with operationalizing partisan warfare as an integrated element of the Soviet war effort. In Ukraine, this task was complicated by geography, broken communication lines, and competing political movements. Despite these challenges, a system of regional partisan headquarters was gradually formed. These bodies were responsible for coordinating sabotage, managing supplies, recruiting fighters, and transmitting intelligence to the Soviet command. By mid-1942, regional headquarters had been established in Kiev, Kharkiv, and Poltava oblasts, though many remained dependent on unreliable couriers and intermittent radio contact. Strategic planning emphasized rail sabotage as the highest priority. The German military machine in the east depended heavily on its rail networks to transport men, equipment, and supplies. Sabotaging these arteries could delay reinforcements, starve frontline units of resources, and weaken morale. The Soviets estimated that disrupting even 10% of railway traffic could have serious consequences on the German ability to sustain offensive operations. Consequently, partisan units were instructed to target railway junctions, bridges, fuel depots, and trains, especially during peak logistical movements. Partisan warfare was also tasked with conducting political work. Detachments were required to distribute Soviet leaflets, organize pro-Soviet committees, and mobilize civilians to support the resistance. This dual-role military and ideological was a key element of Soviet strategy. In areas where partisan groups were strong, they began to create zones of de facto Soviet control. In some northern and central oblasts, partisans established field hospitals, schools, and courts, often deep within forests or swamps. These so-called partisan republics operated semi-independently, and while small in size, they held symbolic value for Soviet propaganda. On the German side, the increasing frequency of attacks prompted the Wehrmacht to reorganize its anti-partisan efforts. Rear area security was placed under the authority of Army Group Rear Areas and the SS's higher SS and police leaders. The Germans formed specialized security divisions, often composed of older or second-line troops, as well as police battalions and auxiliary units recruited from local collaborators. These formations were supported by Luftwaffe reconnaissance and armored cars for mobility in rural terrain. One of the largest German operations against partisans in Ukraine during this period was Operation Hanover, conducted in spring 1942 in the forests of Bryansk and northern Ukraine. Soviet radio broadcasts praised partisan heroes and publicized successful missions. Leaflets distributed in occupied towns called for sabotage, resistance, and solidarity with the Red Army. Stories of German atrocities were circulated to bolster outrage and encourage enlistment into partisan ranks. The message was clear: resistance was a patriotic duty, and those who remained passive were complicit. Despite these efforts, partisan warfare faced serious obstacles. Logistics remained a constant problem. Many detachments struggled to feed themselves, relying on sympathetic villages or raiding German convoys. Medical treatment was rudimentary. Wounded fighters often died of infection or exposure. Communication breakdowns frequently left units isolated. Misidentification between Soviet partisans and other armed groups led to friendly fire and mutual suspicion. The risk of betrayal was ever present, especially in areas where collaboration with the occupiers was widespread out of fear or survival. The Ukrainian population's attitude toward partisan warfare was varied. While some villagers supported the Soviet detachments, others feared reprisals. German anti-partisan sweeps often resulted in mass executions or village burnings. In one documented case in 1942 near Korostin, German troops executed over 120 civilians after partisans destroyed a railway line nearby. Such incidents caused tension between partisans and local populations, who were forced to weigh the risks of resistance against the cost of retribution. Another source of complexity was the presence of nationalist paramilitary groups, particularly in western Ukraine. By the end of 1942, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA, had begun forming its own command structure and training camps, especially in the Volyn and Polisia regions. Though the UPA initially avoided large-scale confrontation with German forces, it focused on eliminating Soviet partisans and perceived collaborators. This created a multipolar conflict in many areas, where villages might be visited by 3 or more armed groups in a single week, each demanding loyalty and resources. In terms of numbers, Soviet documents from the end of 1942 estimated that around 30,000 partisans were active in Ukraine, organized into several hundred detachments. While many of these units were small, some fewer than a dozen fighters, they covered a wide geographic area and operated with increasing daring. German reports recorded over 2,000 acts of sabotage in Ukraine during the last 6 months of 1942, including the destruction of railway tracks, derailing of 170 trains, and the assassination of local officials. Thus, 1942 marked a transition from disorganized, reactive resistance to a more deliberate, strategic partisan war. The groundwork was laid for larger operations to come, but the cost was already high. Civilians faced impossible choices. Fighters risked death daily. Villages bore the brunt of the occupation's violence. Yet even under such pressure, the networks expanded, the weapons flowed, and the forest roads of Ukraine echoed increasingly with the steps of fighters whose war was fought in shadows and silence. Not in the headlines of great battles, but in the margins of every front. By early 1943, the partisan war in Ukraine entered a new phase of intensity. The tide on the Eastern Front was beginning to shift. The catastrophic defeat of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad in February 1943 marked a turning point in the overall strategic balance of the war. For Soviet partisans in Ukraine, this turning point was not just symbolic. It brought with it increased attention from Moscow, more resources, and the expectation that their operations would now directly support forthcoming Red Army offensives. Following directives from the central headquarters of the partisan movement, Ukrainian detachments were instructed to escalate their activities and synchronize them with regular Soviet forces. The overarching goal was to paralyze German logistics and reduce the effectiveness of German rear area operations as the Red Army launched counteroffensives toward the Dnieper and beyond. In this context, partisan actions were no longer limited to isolated sabotage or small ambushes. Coordinated multi-unit raids, infrastructure destruction campaigns, and intelligence gathering for Red Army artillery targeting became regular objectives. A key shift in early 1943 was the use of large-scale sabotage operations targeting Germany's logistical spine, the railway network. One of the most extensive campaigns was the so-called Rail War, initiated in the summer of 1943. While its most intense phase would come later, the groundwork was laid during the spring months. Dozens of partisan units across Ukraine were assigned specific railway lines to disrupt. Explosives were parachuted in, and sappers trained in demolition were deployed to coordinate attacks. In January-March 1943 alone, over 800 rail-related sabotage operations were reported in Ukraine, with nearly 90 German supply trains derailed. Some of these operations reached considerable scale. In the forests near Bryansk, extending into northeastern Ukraine, coordinated efforts by several detachments led to the destruction of multiple key bridges and the temporary isolation of entire German divisions during their withdrawal from the Ural-Kursk region. Partisans used a variety of methods, from crude homemade bombs placed on tracks to timed explosives concealed in rail switches or trestles. Local knowledge allowed them to identify weak points and evade German patrols. The impact of these operations was not limited to physical destruction. German records show that during the first quarter of 1943, rear area security forces in Ukraine were forced to divert nearly 40,000 troops to anti-partisan duties divisions and battalions that might otherwise have reinforced frontline units. This reallocation of manpower was not just a defensive necessity. It reflected the increasing psychological pressure that partisans exerted on the occupiers. Railway guards operated in constant fear of ambush. Supply columns moved more slowly. Casualty rates among German drivers and support personnel rose. The German military command acknowledged in internal reports that partisan activity had begun to impact operational efficiency. In addition to rail sabotage, partisans intensified their attacks on communication lines and administrative infrastructure. Telegraph and telephone poles were cut down in series. Local offices of the German Occupation Administration, especially those responsible for forced labor requisitions and food levies, were attacked. In Zhytomyr Oblast alone, over 70 administrative facilities were attacked in the first half of 1943. These raids often ended with the execution of German-appointed village elders and collaborators, whom partisans saw as extensions of the occupation regime. Partisan intelligence also became increasingly valuable. By 1943, Soviet High Command, Stavka, had established more reliable channels of communication with partisan groups, allowing detailed reports on German troop movements, supply depots, and airfield activity to reach Moscow. One example was the role of partisans in reporting the buildup of German forces near Kharkiv in February 1943. Their intelligence contributed to Red Army preparations for Operation Star and the retaking of the city that month, though German counterattacks would soon reverse those gains temporarily. The German response to this escalation was swift and violent. Anti-partisan operations, now code-named and treated as full-scale military campaigns, multiplied. Operation Winterzauber, Winter Magic, conducted in Belarus but mirrored in several northern Ukrainian oblasts, involved sweeps through forests with infantry, artillery, and air support. These operations aimed not only to destroy partisan units, but also to deprive them of their support base. Villages suspected of aiding partisans were razed. Civilians were deported en masse or killed. In the Chernihiv region, during the spring of 1943, entire hamlets were burned after partisan ambushes on German columns. The total number of civilians killed in German anti-partisan operations in Ukraine during this period is estimated at over 20,000. The cost of resistance remained high. Yet, despite the pressure, partisan forces continued to grow. In the western and northern regions of Ukraine, some detachments had reached battalion strength. They developed mobile strike teams equipped with captured German weapons, automatic rifles, and occasionally light machine guns or mortars dropped by Soviet aircraft. Medical teams, blacksmiths, and even mobile printing presses followed in their wake. Makeshift airstrips were cleared in forest clearings for receiving supplies and wounded personnel. The infrastructure of resistance was no longer just tactical, it was increasingly institutional. Internal discipline also increased. Soviet directives enforced stricter codes of conduct among partisan fighters. Looting, drunkenness, or mistreatment of civilians was punishable by summary execution. Commanders were required to maintain political training sessions and submit regular reports. The goal was not only military success, but ideological cohesion. As the Red Army advanced westward, partisans were seen not just as irregular fighters, but as the vanguard of Soviet restoration. Nevertheless, the landscape of partisan warfare in Ukraine remained fractured. In the West, tensions between Soviet partisans and the growing Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA, escalated. In Volyn and Galicia, clashes between the two forces began to increase. These were not isolated skirmishes, but organized battles. Each side viewed the other as a political and military threat. The Soviets accused the UPA of sabotaging the anti-German struggle, while the UPA saw the Soviet partisans as agents of future reoccupation. In several areas, these rivalries led to local civil wars. Intelligence sharing broke down. Some villages aligned with one faction or the other, and were targeted accordingly. For the local population, survival increasingly meant navigating a dangerous web of competing allegiances, where a misstep could invite destruction from any side. By mid-1943, these dynamics would come to define much of the partisan experience in Western Ukraine, setting the stage for even more violent internal conflict in the years ahead. By the summer of 1943, partisan warfare in Ukraine had moved from sporadic resistance to a nationwide system of irregular warfare. It directly impacted German strategic planning, disrupted logistical routes, forced massive resource reallocation, and provided tangible assistance to the Red Army. Yet it also came with high costs. Tens of thousands of civilian deaths, increasing interfactional violence, and the growing entrenchment of ideological divisions that would outlive the war itself. As the war moved toward its next phase, the partisans were no longer mere survivors. They had become central players in the future of Ukraine's fate. By mid-1943, the partisan movement in Ukraine reached its most expansive and operationally significant phase. As the Red Army prepared for its summer offensives, including the pivotal Battle of Kursk and the subsequent drive toward the Dnieper, partisan units across Ukraine were ordered to intensify their efforts to cripple German rear logistics. This period marked the peak of sabotage activities, especially as Soviet High Command launched coordinated campaigns linking partisan actions with regular army operations. The most critical and systematic partisan campaign during this time was the so-called Rail War, initiated on 3rd August 1943, just days before the Soviet advance into the left bank Ukraine. Orchestrated by the central headquarters of the partisan movement, this operation aimed to paralyze the transportation infrastructure, supporting German forces retreating from the Kursk salient and reinforcing southern fronts. In Ukraine, over 60,000 partisans participated in the coordinated destruction of railway tracks, bridges, telegraph lines, and fuel convoys. Within weeks, Soviet partisans in Ukraine had destroyed more than 600 railway segments, derailed at least 240 trains, and conducted over 3,000 sabotage actions between August and September alone. Major targets included the Kharkiv-Poltava Railway, the Dnipropetrovsk-Kryvyi Rih corridor, and the supply lines near Vinnytsia. These actions delayed troop withdrawals and disrupted German supply columns moving east to fortify positions along the Dnieper River. One notable example occurred near Konotop, where partisan groups under Sidor Kovpak's leadership ambushed a military transport column, destroying 2 ammunition trains and seizing rifles, uniforms, and documents. Kovpak's detachment, which had expanded into a mobile formation capable of operating deep behind enemy lines, symbolized the growing professionalism of Soviet partisan warfare. Operating through Sumy, Poltava, and as far west as Rivne, his forces conducted a 1,000-kilometer raid between June and October, known as the Carpathian Raid. Though only partially successful, the operation demonstrated the ability of partisan formations to conduct long-range, multi-month campaigns while evading destruction. The Rail War campaign was supported by significant logistical efforts from Moscow. Between July and October 1943, over 1,500 tons of equipment and supplies were airdropped into Ukrainian territory. These included small arms, explosives, radios, medical kits, and political literature. Aircraft made over 2,000 sorties, and Soviet pilots often risked flying at night into improvised forest clearings. Partisan detachments established landing zones marked with fires or signals, and then rapidly concealed the drop zones to avoid detection. In parallel with sabotage operations, partisan groups expanded their efforts to dismantle German administrative control. Attacks on police stations, labor offices, and village councils became increasingly frequent. German-appointed mayors and local officials were targeted for assassination. In August 1943, the Soviet partisan unit operating in the Kyiv region executed over 50 German administrators and Ukrainian collaborators, significantly disrupting local governance and the ability to implement forced labor quotas. German command responded by increasing the scope and brutality of anti-partisan operations. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, commanding Army Group South, prioritized rear area security as German positions along the Dnieper began to deteriorate. Special SS and police units, such as Einsatzkommando 10A and Polizei Regiment Süd, were reinforced and directed to launch sweeps into suspected partisan zones. These cleansing operations, known by names such as Aktion Hornung and Aktion Karlsbad, often resulted in mass executions of civilians. German records show that over 30,000 civilians in Ukraine were killed during anti-partisan operations in the second half of 1943. The psychological impact of this campaign was twofold. On the one hand, German forces increasingly viewed the Ukrainian countryside as hostile and ungovernable. On the other, many civilians found themselves caught between terror and loyalty. Some villages provided food and shelter to partisans out of ideological commitment, others out of fear of retribution from resistance groups. Still others attempted neutrality but were punished by either side. The population in contested zones, especially in the forested areas of Zhytomyr, Chernihiv, and Volyn, lived under constant threat, with survival often depending on shifting allegiances. Soviet efforts to coordinate partisan activity reached a new level of sophistication during this period. Panteleimon Ponomarenko's central headquarters issued regular bulletins, updated operational maps, and assigned oblast-level commanders specific objectives tied to the Red Army's campaign calendar. Detachments were encouraged to train local recruits, create redundant communication networks, and form backup command teams in case of casualties. By September 1943, partisans in Ukraine operated under increasingly centralized structures, with oblast, regional, and local headquarters maintaining contact with Moscow through encoded radio transmissions. Alongside military objectives, ideological education remained a priority. Partisan political officers conducted regular sessions, emphasizing loyalty to the USSR, denouncing nationalist groups like the UPA, and reinforcing Stalin's vision of post-war unity. Leaflets, pamphlets, and newspapers, such as Partizanska Pravda, were printed and distributed even in remote areas. Partisan units were evaluated not only on their combat success, but also on their ability to re-Sovietize liberated territories in preparation for the return of Red Army forces. Meanwhile, the conflict with the Ukrainian insurgent army intensified. The UPA, which by mid-1943 had grown into a major irregular force with up to 40,000 fighters, was particularly strong in western and northwestern Ukraine. Its strategic aim diverged fundamentally from that of the Soviet partisans. Where Soviet fighters aimed to restore Soviet rule, the UPA sought to establish an independent Ukrainian state. This made violent confrontation inevitable. In Volyn, Rivne, and parts of Galicia, open warfare broke out between UPA formations and Soviet partisan detachments. Each side accused the other of betrayal, and both vied for control over villages and access to resources. This intra-resistance conflict further complicated civilian life. Villages might be attacked by one group for aiding the other. Soviet partisans condemned the UPA as Nazi collaborators, citing early cooperation with German forces. The UPA countered by portraying Soviet partisans as agents of foreign occupation. Clashes were often brutal, with captured fighters on either side facing summary execution. As the Red Army approached the Dnieper in autumn 1943 and began retaking Kiev in November, partisan units shifted toward open support roles. In many cases, they prepared the way for regular forces by reconnoitering enemy positions, sabotaging communication lines hours before Soviet assaults, or disrupting retreat routes. In the Kyiv region, coordinated action between local partisans and advancing Soviet forces helped isolate German garrisons and accelerate the city's liberation. By the end of 1943, over 150,000 partisans were estimated to be active in Ukraine. Of these, more than 60,000 operated in units that maintained regular contact with Moscow. The remainder were affiliated with local underground networks or functioned semi-independently. Combined, they had conducted tens of thousands of raids, destroyed thousands of kilometers of railway lines, and disrupted the logistics of an army fighting a retreating battle on an 1,800-kilometer front. The partisan war in Ukraine had reached its apex. It was now deeply embedded in the broader Soviet war effort and closely tied to battlefield developments. But it was also marked by fragmentation, internal violence, and a legacy of civilian suffering. As the Red Army reclaimed more territory in early 1944, the nature of resistance would again change, transforming from guerrilla operations to questions of post-war control, political retribution, and the reimposition of centralized authority in a devastated and divided land. The early months of 1944 marked the height of partisan military influence in Ukraine, as the Soviet Red Army launched a series of major offensives aimed at liberating right bank Ukraine from German occupation. Partisan activity during this phase was no longer simply a parallel front. It became an integrated extension of Soviet strategy. Coordinated operations, real-time intelligence exchanges, and direct tactical support for advancing Red Army units made partisan warfare a critical component of the Soviet campaign to retake Ukraine. However, this peak also revealed the full weight of the human cost, the fracturing allegiances among Ukrainians, and the deepening conflict between partisan groups. With the onset of the Dnieper-Carpathian Offensive in January 1944, Soviet High Command activated numerous regional partisan headquarters throughout central and western Ukraine. Units were tasked with cutting off retreating German columns, destroying bridges across the Dniester and southern Bug rivers, and severing roads and railways used for evacuation and resupply. In Vinnytsia and Khmelnytsky oblasts, over a dozen coordinated operations were launched to block German forces from regrouping west of the Dniester line. In one case, near Kamianets-Podilsky, a partisan unit destroyed a railway trestle, derailing an armored train and blocking troop withdrawal for 3 days. The integration of partisan detachments with regular Red Army units reached new levels of coordination. Frontline commanders received real-time intelligence on German troop concentrations and movement from partisan scouts. Special communications units relayed encrypted reports from deep behind enemy lines. Partisan radio operators trained in Moscow relayed target coordinates for artillery and airstrikes. In several oblasts, partisans used flares or ground markers to guide Soviet aviation to German supply depots and fuel trains. In areas like Zhytomyr and Vinnytsia, partisans conducted large-scale ambushes on German convoys. One such operation in March 1944 involved over 500 fighters from multiple units who intercepted and destroyed a retreating German column of 60 vehicles, killing over 200 soldiers and capturing supplies. Mobile partisan groups, now equipped with submachine guns, mortars, and automatic rifles, used forest paths and river crossings to maneuver around static German defenses and harass retreating formations. The tactical evolution of partisans was evident. Units adopted military-style organization, including battalion and regimental structures. Officers with Red Army experience were often inserted into leadership positions. Many detachments now had designated reconnaissance sections, medical teams, engineers, and political officers. As they gained confidence and weapons, they executed increasingly complex maneuvers, including feints, diversionary raids, and multi-day assaults on fortified positions. The Soviet partisan high command increased its expectations. Detachments that failed to meet sabotage or kill quotas were reprimanded or reassigned. Monthly operational goals were introduced, with precise targets set for railway destruction, enemy casualties, and propaganda dissemination. Political indoctrination remained mandatory. Units held weekly ideological sessions to reaffirm commitment to Soviet unity and prepare fighters for re-entry into Soviet civil and military structures following liberation. The cost of these operations was high. German anti-partisan reprisals intensified as the Wehrmacht retreated. In towns such as Shepativka, German forces executed entire families suspected of aiding partisans. In Khmelnytsky Oblast alone, over 4,000 civilians were killed in February-March 1944 in retaliatory sweeps. Villages found to have provided shelter or food to partisan units were burned. In some districts, the German army mined wells, poisoned food stores, and destroyed crops to deprive partisans and civilians of basic survival means during their withdrawal. Civilians in occupied zones often found themselves in untenable positions. Supporting the partisans could result in summary execution by German patrols. Refusing assistance to the resistance could provoke punishment from returning Soviet forces. In territories with shifting control, where German and Soviet forces alternated dominance within weeks, villagers were interrogated by both sides. Each demanded loyalty. Many civilians were forcibly recruited into partisan units, while others fled into forests to avoid both German sweeps and Soviet draft calls. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA, had expanded its operations in western Ukraine. Unlike Soviet partisans, UPA fighters actively resisted both German and Soviet forces. As the Red Army advanced into Galicia and Volyn, open conflict between Soviet partisans and the UPA escalated. In March 1944, In the Rivne region, a three-day battle between a Soviet partisan regiment and a UPA battalion left over 200 dead on both sides. Such confrontations were not isolated incidents, but part of an increasingly bitter internal struggle over the political future of Ukraine. Soviet intelligence reported over 400 engagements with UPA forces in the first quarter of 1944. Propaganda from both sides framed the other as traitors to the nation. The Soviets accused the UPA of collaborating with Nazi forces and undermining the liberation of Ukraine. The UPA condemned Soviet partisans as agents of Moscow, bent on reimposing Stalinist rule. In some regions, this struggle took precedence over operations against the Germans. Skirmishes, ambushes, and even temporary ceasefires with German units were observed as each side focused on defeating its ideological rival. As Soviet forces pushed into the Carpathians and toward the Polish border in spring 1944, partisans increasingly transitioned from guerrilla tactics to administrative control. In retaken areas, partisan commanders were tasked with establishing local Soviet authority. They arrested collaborators, re-established collective farms, reopened schools, and enforced new legal codes. Some partisan units were absorbed into the NKVD or Red Army. Others were disbanded, and their members relocated or demobilized. This transition was not always smooth. In some cases, partisan leaders resisted central authority or clashed with Red Army units over command structures and local decisions. The peak of partisan warfare also exposed the fragmentation within Ukrainian society. Soviet-aligned partisans, UPA fighters, former German auxiliaries, and unaffiliated militias all vied for legitimacy and control. Each claimed to represent the people, but none had a mandate beyond their rifles. In villages caught between multiple factions, loyalty was often pragmatic, based on immediate survival rather than ideological conviction. This chaos made post-liberation stabilization more difficult and sowed the seeds for ongoing unrest, even after the war officially moved westward. Despite the disunity, the overall strategic impact of partisan activity in early 1944 was undeniable. In the first 5 months of the year, Soviet partisans in Ukraine conducted over 15,000 sabotage operations, destroyed 1,200 kilometers of railway track, derailed more than 300 trains, and killed or wounded approximately 40,000 enemy personnel. German reports acknowledged the breakdown of rear area security and the impossibility of full control across large swathes of the Ukrainian countryside. By mid-1944, the German Wehrmacht had been pushed out of most of Ukraine. Only parts of Transcarpathia and pockets along the Carpathian frontier remained under German or Hungarian control. In liberated zones, partisan units were celebrated in Soviet media, and many commanders were awarded decorations such as the Order of Lenin or the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. Yet beneath the surface of victory, tensions simmered between former partisans and returning Soviet administrators, between nationalist aspirations and centralized Soviet power, and between communities that had endured years of dual occupation, reprisal, and conflicting promises. The partisan war in Ukraine had reached its military peak, but it would not vanish with the German retreat. Its aftermath would shape the security policies, political purges, and insurgencies of the post-war years. In the short term, however, it had fulfilled its primary objective: to aid the Red Army's advance, weaken the enemy's hold on Ukraine, and establish the basis for Soviet reoccupation and reconstruction. The next phase would not be about sabotage, but about consolidation and the new forms of resistance that would soon rise in response. As the Red Army reclaimed Ukrainian territory throughout the summer and autumn of 1944, the nature of partisan warfare underwent a significant transformation. With most of Ukraine liberated from German occupation by the end of October, the operational context for Soviet partisans fundamentally changed. Their mission shifted from armed sabotage and irregular warfare to stabilization, political consolidation, and counterinsurgency. At the same time, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA, now operating at its widest territorial extent, adapted its strategy for a new enemy, the Soviet state itself. What emerged in 1944–1945 was not a resolution to the partisan struggle, but its reconfiguration into a broader contest over Ukraine's future political order. In the wake of liberation, Soviet partisan units were either demobilized, integrated into NKVD internal security forces, or absorbed into the Red Army. In regions such as Vinnytsia, Chernihiv, and Kyiv, hundreds of partisan fighters were issued new uniforms, received brief military retraining, and redeployed to frontline duties or to administrative roles in the re-established Soviet apparatus. By November 1944, over 30,000 former partisans had formally joined the Red Army, while another 15,000 were inducted into NKVD and SMERSH formations to serve in rear area security. The Soviet authorities relied heavily on the existing partisan networks to reimpose administrative control. In many villages, partisan commanders had already assumed quasi-governmental roles before the arrival of regular troops. They reinstated kolkhozes, convened local councils, and facilitated the arrest of those accused of collaboration with the Germans. In some oblasts, people's tribunals were conducted with partisan fighters serving as witnesses, prosecutors, or even judges. The NKVD, however, quickly moved to centralize these processes, disbanding unauthorized tribunals and reassigning local authority to vetted Communist Party cadres. A wave of political purges followed. Even some former partisans came under suspicion, especially those from Western Ukraine or those perceived to have maintained ambiguous relations with non-Soviet groups during the occupation. In the months following liberation, the NKVD launched widespread screening operations. Individuals were interrogated about their wartime loyalties, actions, and affiliations. Dozens of partisan leaders were arrested, reassigned, or quietly removed from their posts. Loyalty to Moscow, not wartime valor, became the defining metric of trust. Simultaneously, Soviet attention turned toward the UPA, which refused to disband and instead declared its intention to continue armed resistance against what it now considered a second occupation. UPA leaders, most notably Roman Shukhevych, shifted tactics to adapt to Soviet counterinsurgency methods. Their forces disbanded larger formations in favor of smaller, more mobile units. Underground bunkers, hidden depots, coded communication, and local intelligence networks became standard tools of survival and resistance. In areas like Volyn, Galicia, and parts of Transcarpathia, only recently annexed into the Ukrainian SSR UPA units, launched a campaign of ambushes, assassinations, and sabotage targeting Soviet officials, NKVD agents, and local communist leaders. Soviet transportation and logistics infrastructure became targets once again, though now the attackers were Ukrainian nationalists rather than Soviet partisans. Between late 1944 and the end of 1945, UPA forces conducted hundreds of attacks, some involving coordinated raids on district centers, military convoys, and railway stations. In response, the Soviet state launched a vast and violent counterinsurgency campaign. The NKVD formed special task groups, Operativno-Chekistki Grupy, that combined military, police, and intelligence capabilities. These groups employed mass arrests, torture-based interrogations, and forced deportations to break the UPA's rural support base. In western Ukraine alone, over 100,000 people were arrested in 1945, many of them accused of sheltering insurgents or withholding information. Entire villages were forcibly resettled to break partisan supply chains. One of the core strategies adopted by the NKVD was infiltration. Soviet agents disguised as UPA fighters infiltrated nationalist units, sowed distrust, and orchestrated false flag attacks to discredit their leadership. Forensic impersonation, forged orders, and manipulated correspondence led to intra-insurgent purges and disintegration of command structures. Meanwhile, radio interception and decoded messages provided Soviet units with real-time intelligence on UPA movements. Despite these efforts, the UPA proved resilient. Its fighters operated in terrain ideal for guerrilla warfare: dense forests, mountainous borderlands, and rural zones with limited Soviet infrastructure. Moreover, UPA enjoyed significant support among segments of the local population disillusioned by collectivization, political repression, and the memory of Stalinist purges. Leaflets, clandestine newspapers, and underground schools propagated the message of Ukrainian independence, framing the struggle not as terrorism, but as a national liberation war. While the Soviet narrative cast UPA fighters as bandits and fascist collaborators, the situation on the ground was more complex. Many villages were divided by kinship ties, wartime experiences, and the desire for stability. Some residents provided silent aid to insurgents. Others cooperated with the authorities to protect their families. The result was a society torn by surveillance, betrayal, and the trauma of dual authority. Soviet power was restored on paper, but contested in practice. In addition to UPA, smaller nationalist or anti-Soviet groups emerged, including remnants of Melnik's OUNM faction and localized self-defense bands. Some of these formations lacked ideological cohesion, but resisted Soviet rule for personal or communal reasons. The NKVD treated all such groups as part of the broader bandit underground and targeted them accordingly. The psychological warfare intensified. Soviet propaganda labeled insurgents as enemies of peace and progress, accusing them of collaborating with the Nazis and sabotaging reconstruction. Public trials, paraded corpses, denunciations in schools, and loyalty oaths became common tools. Partisan heroes from the anti-German struggle were used in posters to contrast good patriots with criminal saboteurs. At the same time, the UPA distributed flyers accusing Soviet authorities of being occupiers who had simply replaced one tyrant with another. Competing visions of history, legitimacy, and national identity clashed in every leaflet, every whisper, and every grave. The scale of the counterinsurgency was immense. By the end of 1945, over 600,000 Soviet personnel were involved in anti-UPA operations across western Ukraine, including NKVD troops, militia, and Red Army units. Mass deportations became systemic. Between 1944 and 1947, approximately 250,000 people from western Ukraine were deported to Siberia and Central Asia under charges of banditry or nationalist sympathies. Entire communities vanished overnight, replaced by Soviet settlers or surrounded by garrisons and watchtowers. Former Soviet partisans who had once led anti-German campaigns were now reassigned to identify and eliminate nationalist insurgents. Some participated willingly, others expressed unease at the new mission. For those who had fought in the forests of 1941-1943, the reversal of roles becoming enforcers of centralized control marked a moral ambiguity that official Soviet historiography never acknowledged. Thus, in the immediate aftermath of the German retreat, Ukraine did not experience peace, but rather a transformation of the partisan war into an internal conflict. While the front lines had moved westward into Central Europe, the forests of Ukraine remained contested ground. Sabotage, revenge killings, and political executions replaced battles and ambushes. The language of resistance changed, but the weapons remained the same. In this new phase, the goal was not to defeat a foreign occupier, but to define who had the right to rule the land they both claimed to have liberated. By 1946, the partisan struggle in Ukraine had morphed into a complex, internalized conflict, one no longer defined by foreign occupation, but by a fierce contest over sovereignty, identity, and memory. The NKVD, and later the newly formed Ministry for State Security, MGB, escalated their operations against the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA, and other anti-Soviet underground elements, applying increasingly systematic and industrialized methods of suppression. Yet, despite this pressure, the resistance did not immediately collapse. Instead, it adapted, fracturing into more clandestine, resilient networks that continued to operate in defiance of the Soviet state. The post-war years brought new forms of adaptation for insurgent forces. By 1946, the UPA had largely abandoned its larger mobile formations in favor of decentralized cells. Most units now consisted of 5 to 15 fighters, often locals operating within their own regions. They avoided large engagements and focused on targeted assassinations of Soviet officials, intelligence gathering, propaganda distribution, and maintaining communications between underground nodes. Hidden bunkers, concealed printing presses, and stashes of weapons and documents were buried in forests, beneath barns, or even inside cemeteries. The Soviet response to this guerrilla adaptation was comprehensive. The MGB deployed special internal troops and militarized police, as well as newly trained Spetsnaz-like squads for forest operations. One of the most notable strategies was the deployment of Agent Combat Groups, ABG, Soviet operatives disguised as UPA fighters. These units infiltrated villages, posed as insurgents, and extracted intelligence under false pretenses before eliminating real members or collaborators. Their success depended on meticulous preparation, dialect mimicry, and forged credentials. Dozens of UPA units were neutralized using this tactic, often after elaborate traps and staged betrayals. The civilian toll remained staggering. Between 1944 and 1947, an estimated 500,000 people in western Ukraine were arrested, interrogated, or deported under suspicion of aiding nationalist forces. Villages were routinely surrounded, and all male residents taken for questioning. In some cases, entire communities were removed and sent to remote settlements in Siberia and Kazakhstan. The 1946-1947 famine, exacerbated by post-war shortages and state requisitioning, further devastated the countryside. Soviet authorities accused UPA fighters of sabotaging food deliveries and hiding grain, while insurgents accused the Soviets of using starvation as a weapon to break resistance. One of the major turning points came in 1947 with Operation West, Operacja Zachid. On 21 October, Soviet authorities launched a mass deportation campaign that targeted families of known or suspected UPA members and supporters. Within 3 days, over 76,000 people were deported from Ukraine to Kazakhstan and Siberia. Trains carrying deportees operated in near silence, with names and destinations withheld. Many deportees were elderly, women, and children. Few ever returned. Operation West was designed not only to break UPA logistics, but to sever its moral and social foundations. By removing wives, children, and siblings from the conflict zone, Soviet authorities aimed to isolate insurgents psychologically and logistically. This tactic, while brutal, proved partially effective. Dozens of UPA commanders either surrendered or were captured shortly after these deportations, unable to continue without community support. Yet, the UPA and its political arm, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, OUNB, continued to adapt. Underground schools were established to train new leaders in secret. Insurgent propaganda shifted tone, framing their cause not merely as anti-Soviet, but as part of a larger European struggle against totalitarianism. Leaflets appealed to Western audiences, calling attention to the Allied betrayal of Eastern Europe at Yalta. Some even carried messages in English, French, or German, expressing hopes for American or British intervention. These appeals went unanswered, but they reflected the insurgents' awareness of global politics and their determination to cast themselves as part of a broader ideological conflict. The Soviet state recognized the ideological component of the conflict and responded with equal force. New histories were published that described the UPA as bourgeois nationalist bandits and agents of fascism. Films, schoolbooks, and radio programs repeated these narratives, aiming to reshape memory and cast Soviet rule as inevitable and just. In contrast, insurgent publications, often handwritten or mimeographed, painted the Soviet system as a colonial empire and celebrated fallen fighters as martyrs for a free Ukraine. The intensity of the conflict peaked between 1946 and 1948. During this period, the MGB reported over 8,000 armed confrontations with insurgent groups across western Ukraine. Hundreds of Soviet officials, local Communist Party leaders, and informants were killed in targeted assassinations. In one operation near Ivano-Frankivsk in 1947, a UPA unit ambushed a convoy carrying regional NKVD officers, killing over a dozen and capturing sensitive documents. Such operations were rare but symbolically potent, sustaining the morale of an increasingly isolated insurgency. Soviet counterinsurgency operations became more mobile and flexible in response. New policies permitted field commanders to issue summary execution orders against suspected fighters. Special blockades were organized, with military units sealing entire valleys or forested areas, conducting exhaustive searches, interrogating every villager, and staying for weeks. These operations disrupted insurgent movements, destroyed safe houses, and depleted supplies. Yet the cost in manpower and morale for the Soviet side was also significant. By 1948, the insurgency was clearly weakening. The senior leadership of the OUNB and UPA had been pushed into deeper concealment. Roman Shukevich, the UPA's commander-in-chief, moved from hideout to hideout, managing operations through secret couriers and coded instructions. The movement had lost many of its regional commanders. Its logistical infrastructure had been heavily damaged, and its ability to launch coordinated actions was severely diminished. Still, scattered cells continued their operations, now more symbolic than strategic. Even minor actions painting slogans, destroying Soviet flags, or posting leaflets were meant to signal that the flame of resistance had not been extinguished. The Soviet state, for its part, refused to relent. Schools introduced compulsory denunciation sessions. Children were encouraged to report parents or neighbors suspected of aiding bandits. Pioneers and Komsomol members were trained to identify UPA symbols and memorize lists of suspected insurgents. The entire structure of Soviet civil life in western Ukraine was weaponized to reinforce control and uproot remaining sympathies for resistance. Culturally, the division deepened. Families of partisans, deportees, or political prisoners were stigmatized. They were denied university access, excluded from party jobs, and often assigned the lowest housing or food rations. Official ceremonies and Soviet holidays were enforced with increasing rigidity. Meanwhile, in whispers and secret gatherings, songs, prayers, and memories of the resistance were preserved, often passed down orally to avoid detection. What the state tried to erase, communities quietly archived. Thus, by the end of 1948, while the operational capacity of the UPA had been greatly reduced, its ideological legacy remained deeply embedded in Western Ukrainian society. The Soviet state had regained control of the territory, but not entirely of its people. What had begun as a partisan war against a foreign occupier had become, in its final transformation, a war over identity, legitimacy, and historical memory. A war not of positions, but of narratives. One fought as fiercely in the forests as in the minds of the next generation. By 1949, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA, and the remnants of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, OUNB, faced an increasingly desperate reality. The Soviet state had succeeded in retaking the territory, destroying most major resistance structures, and isolating insurgents from their logistical and moral support bases. However, while the scale of armed conflict diminished, the Soviet campaign did not end. What followed was a protracted and methodical suppression of the remaining cells, an intensification of psychological warfare, and a concerted effort to erase the memory and meaning of the partisan war from public life. The elimination of UPA Commander-in-Chief Roman Shukevich on 5 March 1950 by MGB operatives near Lviv marked a critical blow to the insurgent movement. Shukevich, who had spent nearly 5 years operating underground, represented the symbolic heart of the resistance. His death was not just a military success for Soviet counterinsurgency forces, but a meticulously planned political statement. His body was publicly displayed, his hideout photographed, and the operation presented in official bulletins as a triumph of the Soviet system over bandit nationalism. In the months following his death, the Soviet state intensified its efforts to destroy the last elements of the underground. Former UPA fighters and OUN leaders were pursued with increasing precision. High-value targets were identified through years of intelligence work, torture-based interrogations, and the infiltration of resistance networks. The MGB deployed psychological warfare units that forged correspondence between insurgents to provoke distrust and splinter groups. Entire partisan safehouses were neutralized not through force, but by sowing suspicion and manipulating loyalties. Despite the crushing pressure, some resistance continued. Isolated cells remained active in the Carpathians, especially in Ivano-Frankivsk and Zakarpattia regions. These units, often composed of a handful of men with local knowledge, survived by rotating between bunkers and relying on tight-knit civilian networks. Their operations became smaller in scope, targeting individual NKVD officers, distributing leaflets, or staging symbolic acts such as burning Soviet flags. Though militarily insignificant, these actions maintained a sense of continuity and served as acts of defiance in a society under totalitarian control. The Soviet authorities responded with sustained deportation campaigns. Between 1949 and 1952, tens of thousands more Ukrainians were arrested or exiled. Even children of suspected partisans were placed into special, state-run institutions for ideological re-education. Those deemed politically unreliable were often forced into internal exile or assigned to remote construction sites in Siberia or the Urals. Family members were instructed never to speak of the past. Any trace of participation in or support for the partisan movement was removed from official biographies, employment records, and school applications. In tandem, the state launched a campaign of historiographical erasure. Archives were sealed, partisan documents destroyed or altered, and official historians instructed to frame the 1941–1950 conflict as a criminal insurgency orchestrated by fascist collaborators and Western spies. Schools taught a version of the war in which Soviet partisans had heroically liberated Ukraine from German occupation, while the UPA had betrayed their homeland. Monuments were erected to Red Army units and Soviet partisans. None were permitted for fallen UPA fighters. Wartime songs, memoirs, or stories referencing the nationalist resistance were banned. However, in private, many Ukrainians preserved these memories. In family circles, stories were shared about sons who disappeared into the forest, daughters who served as couriers, and relatives who vanished during midnight arrests. These oral traditions, though suppressed, endured in whispers, songs, embroidery patterns, and graveyards without names. Resistance had shifted from armed struggle to memory, a war over historical truth, now fought within households rather than forests. Internationally, the West showed little inclination to intervene. With the start of the Cold War, U.S. and British intelligence agencies showed occasional interest in the Ukrainian underground as a potential anti-Soviet asset. Programs like MI6's Operation Valuable and CIA efforts attempted to insert agents or re-establish contact with nationalist networks. However, most such attempts failed. Soviet counterintelligence, bolstered by deep penetration of émigré groups and signal intelligence, neutralized or turned many operatives. Western governments, prioritizing geopolitical stability over covert insurgency, eventually scaled back such initiatives. By the early 1950s, the partisan war in Ukraine had largely ended as an active armed movement. What remained was a fragmented, symbolic underground, sustained by memory rather than capability. Soviet security services shifted their focus from extermination to surveillance, watching families of former fighters, monitoring cemeteries on significant anniversaries, and deploying informants in schools, churches, and workplaces. The state's goal was not just to defeat an army, but to permanently remove the conditions that had allowed resistance to take root. In the villages and forests where partisans once operated, the physical traces of the war were deliberately erased. Bunkers were collapsed with explosives, cemeteries flattened, and memorial stones removed or repurposed. In some cases, forest paths were redirected and maps redrawn. The very geography of resistance was overwritten. Meanwhile, the state promoted new cultural rituals, harvest festivals, collective farm parades, and veterans' commemorations that emphasized Soviet victory and loyalty. These were designed not only to replace the memory of the partisan war, but to make alternative narratives appear not just dangerous, but unimaginable. Yet for all the Soviet success in dismantling the partisan infrastructure, the struggle's deeper causes, national identity, historical trauma, and political autonomy remained unresolved. For many in Western Ukraine, the experience of occupation, resistance, and repression was internalized as a collective silence present in behaviors, distrust of outsiders, and a guarded attitude toward the state. Teachers, priests, and elders passed on fragments of history to the next generation, careful to avoid detection, but determined to preserve what official texts denied. Ironically, the scale and duration of the suppression may have helped preserve the partisan legacy. Unlike brief uprisings elsewhere in the USSR, the Ukrainian resistance endured nearly a decade after the end of World War II. Its longevity, complexity, and regional character made it impossible to fully expunge. When, decades later, the Soviet system began to collapse, these buried narratives resurfaced, bringing with them old symbols, songs, and stories that had not been destroyed, only hidden. The end of armed conflict in the forests of Ukraine in the early 1950s did not signify resolution. Rather, it marked the end of one phase and the beginning of another, a long, cold aftermath in which the true nature of the partisan war would be contested in archives, courtrooms, and public memory for generations to come. For the Soviet state, it was a hard-won victory in a domestic war. For the insurgents and those who remembered them, it was a defeat without surrender. The weapons were buried, but the idea remained. The partisan war in Ukraine, spanning from 1941 through the early 1950s, left behind a legacy as complex as the conflict itself. It was a war fought in forests and villages, on rail lines and inside schools, in both open defiance and whispered remembrance. Though it ended without formal declaration or peace accord, its consequences reverberated through Ukrainian society long after the last shots were fired. The question of how this war is remembered, and by whom, has become a contested space where history, politics, and identity continue to collide. During the Soviet era, the official narrative of the war was rigid and unyielding. In state-sanctioned historiography, only one form of partisan activity was acknowledged and glorified: the Soviet resistance to the Nazi occupation. Monuments, textbooks, and films celebrated Soviet partisans as heroic defenders of the motherland. Names like Cedar Kovpak and Oleksiy Fedorov were immortalized in bronze and granite across Ukraine. Their units were presented as the vanguard of patriotic sacrifice, acting in coordination with the Red Army to liberate Ukraine from fascism. Conversely, nationalist partisans, particularly those of the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA, were vilified. Soviet propaganda consistently labeled the UPA as bourgeois nationalist, fascist collaborators, and terrorist bandits. The complexities of their motivations, the shifting alliances under occupation, and the vast social support they received in Western Ukraine were omitted or distorted. Archives were sealed, memoirs suppressed, and families of former insurgents were often denied access to higher education, employment, or political participation. In public discourse, there was no space to question the monolithic portrayal of the partisan war. Still, unofficial memory endured. In many villages of Galicia, Volyn, and the Carpathians, local oral histories quietly preserved the stories of those who had fought for a vision of Ukrainian independence. These narratives passed from one generation to the next, in songs, embroidery patterns, coded language, and gravestones marked with blank names. Even in Soviet times, candles were lit on certain anniversaries, and children were warned not to repeat at school what they heard at home. Memory was a form of quiet resistance, a survival of meaning under conditions of forced silence. Following Ukraine's independence in 1991, the opening of archives and the removal of Soviet censorship allowed these suppressed narratives to re-emerge. Historians began re-evaluating the partisan war with new urgency. The rediscovery of thousands of documents, field orders, personal diaries, NKVD reports, enabled a more nuanced understanding of the conflict's internal dynamics. Scholars debated the nature of the UPA, its early cooperation with German forces, its later resistance to both the Nazis and Soviets, and its role in ethnic violence, particularly against Polish civilians in Volhynia. These debates highlighted the moral ambiguities of wartime survival and the difficulty of imposing simple labels on complex actors. In the public sphere, the re-evaluation of the UPA ignited passionate debate. For many in Western Ukraine, the UPA became a symbol of national resilience, a homegrown force that resisted both foreign empires. Streets were renamed after UPA leaders. Statues were erected to Roman Shukhevych and Stepan Bandera. Veterans organizations emerged to commemorate fallen fighters. The red and black flag of the UPA became a common sight at nationalist rallies and commemorative events. In contrast, other regions of Ukraine, particularly in the south and east, remained skeptical or outright hostile to this re-evaluation. Soviet partisan veterans and their descendants viewed the glorification of the UPA as a revisionist affront. Accusations of wartime atrocities, collaboration with Nazi Germany, and nationalist extremism were cited as reasons to reject any rehabilitation of the UPA's image. Political parties, especially those with ties to former Soviet institutions, mobilized these sentiments to resist historical reinterpretation. This divergence in memory contributed to deepening regional divides within Ukraine, especially in moments of political crisis. The issue became increasingly politicized in the 2000s. Presidential administrations took contrasting positions. Some endorsed recognition of the UPA as freedom fighters, while others upheld Soviet-era condemnation. In 2010, the awarding of the title Hero of Ukraine to Roman Shukhevych and posthumously to Stepan Bandera provoked sharp domestic and international backlash. Russia and Poland both condemned the decision, citing historical grievances and wartime crimes. Ukrainian courts later annulled the titles, reflecting the unstable legal and political terrain of historical memory. Despite this, grassroots commemoration continued to grow. Youth organizations held reenactments, restored partisan bunkers, and published memoirs of surviving insurgents. Academic conferences explored the war's psychological, cultural, and social dimensions. Public discourse increasingly acknowledged that the partisan war was not a peripheral episode, but a central struggle in Ukraine's 20th century history. One that revealed the fractures, aspirations, and traumas of a people caught between totalitarian empires. Internationally, the legacy of Ukraine's partisan war has also gained renewed attention. With the post-Cold War re-evaluation of Eastern European history, scholars from abroad began engaging with Ukrainian sources, expanding the historiographical debate. Comparisons were drawn with anti-communist resistance movements in the Baltic states and Poland. The complexity of collaboration, resistance, and survival in occupied territories became a key theme in broader studies of World War II and its aftermath. The memory of the partisan war also gained contemporary relevance in Ukraine's modern geopolitical context. Following Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the war in Donbass, narratives of national resistance regained political urgency. Imagery of past insurgents was invoked in parallel with modern volunteer battalions and territorial defense forces. The symbolism of local resistance, sacrifice, and defiance became a core element of Ukrainian civic identity, particularly during periods of external aggression. In educational reform, new textbooks presented a more pluralistic account of the wartime years. Students now read about both Soviet and nationalist partisans, the tragedies of civilian reprisals, and the ethical dilemmas of life under occupation. Monuments previously dedicated only to Red Army figures were supplemented or replaced by memorials recognizing victims of political repression, deportation, and dual occupation. Local museums expanded exhibits to include testimonies from all sides of the conflict. Yet reconciliation remains incomplete. Competing interpretations of the partisan war persist, often shaped by regional identity, family memory, and political affiliation. In some communities, monuments to Soviet partisans stand near those of UPA fighters, each attracting different commemorations. In others, the wounds of wartime violence remain unspoken, the graves unmarked, and the debates unresolved. National unity around a shared memory of the conflict remains elusive. Today, the partisan war in Ukraine is not simply a matter of the past. It is an active field of historical negotiation. Its significance lies not only in the scale of its violence or the duration of its struggle, but in its enduring capacity to shape how Ukrainians understand themselves, their history, and their sovereignty. It was a war of sabotage, revenge, and survival, but also a war of meaning, one whose echoes continue to shape the country's culture, politics, and collective memory long after the gunfire ceased.